Hello, and welcome to the Boston Globe Sustainability Week. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to thank our underwriters for their support. Philips, our presenting sponsor, as well as the International Business School at Brandeis University and the Museum of Science. On behalf of all of us, we hope you enjoy the program.
Hi, my name is Robert Metzger, and I'm the Global Head of Sustainability for Philips. Earlier this month, the IPCC released its latest climate report. Grounded by leading global scientists, the research states we are at a crossroad. The decisions we make now can secure a livable future. For me, three things stood out from the report. First of all, options exist across all sectors to at least halve emissions by 2030. Secondly, investments in low-carbon solutions will need to increase by at least sixfold. And thirdly, we can and we must all play a role. I'm really grateful to be speaking with you about the importance of stepping up climate action and the need to drastically reduce our CO2 emissions. This week-long event series brings together different perspectives and actionable solutions from private and public sector leaders to ensure a healthy planet for future generations. And fittingly, this year's programming will conclude on Earth Day, Friday, April 22nd. Imagine if healthcare were a country, it would be the fifth largest CO2 emitter globally, and this needs to change. At Philips, we operate carbon neutrally since 2020, and we increasingly design our products to be more energy efficient, and customers can trade in medical equipment after use for refurbishment and remanufacturing, ready for a second life. Now, last year, our circular revenues already accounted for 16% of sales, and we sent zero waste to landfill. Change to combat the climate crisis needs to come from everywhere and from all of us. And I hope the upcoming presentations inspire you to start contributing too. To kick off Sustainability Week, I'd like to introduce you now to Globe climate reporter Sabrina Schenkman for her virtual fireside chat with Governor Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, the state that is also home to our Philips Innovation Center and the Philips North America headquarters in Cambridge. Thank you.
All right. Well, hello, and thank you for joining us as we kick off this year's Sustainability Week with a very exciting fireside chat. My name is Sabrina Schenkman, and I report on climate change at the Boston Globe, part of our recently launched Into the Red climate coverage that aims to shine a light on climate change in a way that meets the urgency of the moment that we're in. I am thrilled today to have the opportunity to speak with Governor Charlie Baker, who in his 7 years in office has helped steer Massachusetts to committing to getting to net zero emissions by 2050. For the first part of the event, Governor Baker and I will be talking about his work on climate change while in office. And then in about 20 minutes, I'll switch gears and ask questions that have been submitted ahead of time or by those tuning in. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to get to as many questions as I can. So Governor Baker, welcome.
How you doing, Sabrina?
Good, thanks. Good to have you here.
Good. I'm just so you know,
yeah.
I tend to write things down when I'm in person meetings, which means I'm going to be doing that virtually. I'm not listening to what you say if I bow my head and start writing something down. I'm actually doing exactly the opposite.
If you want to doodle, you can doodle. That's fine.
It's not doodling.
I'm just kidding. No, as a journalist, I totally understand the need to take notes. So, well, great. As we're coming to the end of your time in office, I really appreciate you being here to talk about your thoughts on climate change. And to kick things off, I want to start back at the beginning, or at least 12 years ago. Back in 2010, when you were asked about climate change, you told a Globe reporter then, I'm not saying I believe in it. I'm not saying I don't. You're asking me to take a position on something I don't know enough about. But then 11 years later, you signed one of the nation's most ambitious climate laws. So it's safe to say there was a change of heart along the way. And I'm curious if you could just talk to us about, what happened back then and how you got to where you are now. I'm curious if there was a key moment or a key person in that evolution.
I wouldn't say there was a key moment or a key person. I think it was more what we might call the preponderance of the evidence. And in some respects, a lot of the conversations and a lot of the reading that I did over the last 11 years involves a lot more than just what we would call kind of the scientific community. Obviously, their opinions are incredibly important here, but when you're talking to farmers and you're talking to the fishing community and you're talking to people who manage resorts and you're talking to to folks for whom climate and weather is emergency management personnel. When you're talking to people for whom climate and weather is like their life, and they're saying to you things like, this is no longer that storm, this heat wave, this whatever it is, it's no longer, you know, something that happens as an anomaly once in a while. Everything about my life, my business, my day-to-day has changed. It starts to become pretty clear that these people aren't trying to win an argument, all right? They're trying to figure out how they survive in a world that's changed completely around them. And I think in some ways, those voices don't always get the attention that they deserve. Although they are in many respects, as I said, not trying to win an argument. They're literally saying, you know, if something doesn't change, everything about the way I think about my life, my family, my business is going to be gone. And that certainly gets my attention, along with the rest of the preponderance of the evidence as well. I'll give you a really simple statistic. FEMA, a couple of years ago before the pandemic, and I don't remember if it was even my first term or my second term, but it was somewhere in the mid to late teens. We had an NGA meeting down in DC, and I went to the meeting with FEMA because I was actually interested in talking to them about resiliency, adaptation, and rebuild. FEMA tends to let you rebuild things to the way they were, not to the way they probably need to be to deal with the future. And they talked about the fact that in the 3 previous years, they had spent more money on recovery, disaster recovery, than they had spent in the previous 20, which from my point of view, pretty compelling evidence that things are very different than they used to be, and we need to accept that and deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, that time period is really when we saw the conversation about climate change going from the Arctic and small developing nations to happening in our backyard here in New England. So I want to go a little further toward the present. So 2019, right as the issue of climate change was reaching a fever pitch of partisanship, you testified in Congress about the work being done in Massachusetts and how it was really rising above political party. And I'm sorry to quote you again here, but you testified, in Massachusetts, climate change is not a partisan issue. While we sometimes disagree on specific policies, we understand the science and know the impacts are real because we're experiencing them firsthand. I'm curious, Governor Baker, when you look outside Massachusetts, has it been lonely as a Republican working on these climate issues? Like, what has that experience been like?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you pointed out that I pointed out that in Massachusetts anyway, the Republicans in the legislature and the governors, when they're Republicans, support the vast majority of the initiatives that we've been pursuing here in Massachusetts for the better part of the past 20 years. I guess what I would say is that, you know, depending upon how you see the world and what you choose to work on, that's going to define in many ways where you apply resources and attention when you're in one of these jobs. And it's certainly true that I have spent a significant amount of time and energy and money on these issues over the course of my 7 years, more so than many of my colleagues. But I happen to think we're doing the right thing. And many of my Republican colleagues, governors and others, give me what I would describe as a good-natured hard time about it. But I think everybody's sympathetic to the fact, at least most of us in elective office, that the places we choose to focus on, the things we choose to work on, you know, those are our calls. And we shouldn't necessarily presume everybody's going to pay attention to the same things. But it is, at times it's a slightly different place than I find a lot of my colleagues in. Yeah.
Imagine so. Do you ever find that you're able to, like, through a conversation, perhaps get through to a Republican colleague in the way that someone on the opposite, you know, in the Democratic Party might not be able to? Like, have there been any moments of awakening or recognition, like, oh, hey, maybe you're on the right track there?
I have asked a number of my colleagues in the past to talk to the farmers and to the resort operators and to the fishing community in the places where those are significant parts of their constituency. And they have, in some cases, gotten back to me and said, you know, that was actually pretty eye-opening, and it's going to require us to think a little bit more about how we engage on some of this stuff.
Oh, interesting. So I'm not sure if you saw, but today we had a story about a poll that was just released. It was a poll by Mass Inc. that in collaboration with the Boston Globe, and we were asking folks about climate change and their thoughts on it. And one of the top line findings was that Massachusetts residents, the number of Massachusetts residents who said they consider climate change a very serious issue has actually declined since a poll asked the same thing in 2019. And I'm curious what you make of that.
I think we need to remember that it's always, all these questions that the pollsters ask are always, well, compared to what, right? And the compared to what sometimes changes. I mean, my own person on the street conversations would lead you to believe that the most important thing people talk to me about remains jobs in the economy. The second biggest thing I hear about is the learning loss. I talk to a lot of parents, the learning loss associated with what the pandemic has done to kids through and in education. The third biggest thing I hear people talk about is the press on the healthcare system that's come with the pandemic. And that's not to say that they don't still, I mean, yeah. I saw a story about that led me to believe that in your paper that I think said that the climate's still a very big deal to people. But if you ask them to compare it to some of these other issues that are literally right here in front of their face, I'm not surprised that in the moment, there are some other things they're more concerned about. That doesn't mean they're any less concerned about this. They're just more concerned about some of this stuff that's directly in front of them. And if you're having trouble, you know, paying your rent because it went up 50%, or your property taxes on your house, or you're having a hard time just filling your tank, I don't think, it's not surprising to me that in this moment, compared to those things, something that is a concern and has been a concern and will continue to be a concern to people might get, you know, moved back a little in the moment. Sure.
It's a stiff competition for biggest, scariest thing right now, unfortunately.
There's a lot of those things out there right now.
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges facing Massachusetts, and that your administration has been working on tackling, and something that I've written about quite a bit, is how to get the kind of massive household level change that's needed in order to reach our climate goals. As we've reported, Massachusetts is struggling to get people to adopt electric heat pumps or electric vehicles at the rate that's called for in the state's own roadmap plan. And I'm curious what you think is needed most to catalyze that level of change.
Well, I certainly think the changes that were recently made in January in the Mass Save program can help a lot with respect to heat pumps. I'm actually going to have somebody come take a look at my house and see what they think. Nice. So I probably shouldn't have said that. That will make the press on. That will make my media people unhappy. But I think there's like a mythology out there that heat pumps won't work in single family freestanding homes in a cold climate like this one. Well, I would like to put that to the test. And I think given the advancement in the technology there, it's probably no longer true. But I think part of to deal with the issue you're talking about, a big part of what we've tried to do as an administration with many of our building code adjustments is to continue to focus on making buildings, anything that's new especially, much more energy efficient, no matter what your source of energy is, so that you're using less than you were using before, and recognizing and understanding that over time, the goal has to be to find a way into the existing housing stock. Now, you may know that several years ago, now I'm going back, I think 5 or 6 years ago, I proposed a bill that would basically have required, as part of the sale of any residential facility, any house, that you would have to get what's called a HERS measurement on it, which is sort of an energy efficiency index measure, sort of the equivalent of a miles per gallon thing that you see on the windshield or on the window of a new car when you buy it. My point in that was, I don't think most people have any idea how efficient or inefficient their home is. And if we could figure out a point in time when everybody would have to actually figure that out and then do something about it through Mass Save or some other program, that would be a way to bring this to the attention of people and engage what I call the existing infrastructure we have, which is way bigger than what the new infrastructure will be, at least for the next 10 years, to try and kickstart that conversation and make it happen. I don't think that bill even got out of committee. And I still think in some way, if you really want to get people to pay attention to this, you got to give them some way to do so and some way to measure how they're actually performing. And then use something like Mass Save as the vehicle that makes it possible for people to actually do the things they would need to do to improve the energy efficiency of their home.
It's interesting because maybe you were ahead of your time, or you must have been, because now in the conversations with the work coming through the Senate and through the House and with Attorney General Maura Healey and her climate plan, there's this seems to have reemerged as a concept. So it's interesting to hear.
Most of the times in public life, you're either wrong, early, or late.
That makes sense. All right, I'm going to switch over to questions from the audience in just a second, but I did want to ask you this. There were two pretty crushing blows that were dealt to the state's clean energy plans last year. First, with the loss of the Interstate Transportation and Climate Initiative that you had been a big supporter of, and then also with the vote in Maine that, for now at least, has cut off hopes of bringing hydroelectric power from Quebec. And those were two pretty big slices of the pie of how Massachusetts was going to get where it wants to go. And I'm curious, this is sort of a two-part question. First, what was it like being you as those two things that were totally out of your control fell apart? And then the second is, can we still get there without those pieces of the pie?
I still think regional collaboratives are a good thing. I think I was kind of surprised that even states where they had the authority to do something with respect to transportation chose not to. But it was kind of an interesting experience and learning to understand the difference between, where you could get sort of general agreement on the goal and the objective and then not find agreement on sort of a mechanism to achieve it. I do think the bipartisan infrastructure law put some pretty significant resources on the table, which were part of our mass track filing about a month ago. And I do think we'll get some attention from the legislature. And I certainly think that, combined with some of the stuff that are in the House and Senate bills, can certainly help on that. The main thing isn't over yet, although I will say this, and I've said it before. If you really want to electrify a lot of stuff that's currently not electrified, you have to be willing to acknowledge that that's going to require some pretty significant investments in what I call, sort of the guts of making that happen. And a big part of that is transmission. It makes me very worried, tell you the truth. The main thing, which is still in play, okay, it's in the courts, but that makes me very nervous about whether or not we're actually going to get all the offshore wind that we talk about, because that's hundreds and hundreds of transmission hookups that all the way up and down the East Coast we're going to need to actually deliver on that. And since you're going to go to the audience questions, the one other thing I would say that's a little bit off topic on your question, innovation has got to be a big part of this. And, if you think about the pandemic, there was a lot we could do with policy and with sort of behavior modification, but in the end, it was a mad dash to develop vaccines that worked and therapeutics that worked that really got us out of this. And I sort of feel that in this energy space, there are a lot of things we can do with policy, but there are going to be some breakthroughs that take us way beyond where we are today to where we need to go, and we need to support them. And that's why the $750 million that we filed several times now with the legislature to invest in energy innovation is such an important part of this. I mean, there's a company up in Andover called 6K, which stands for the temperature of the heat on the surface of the sun, which basically pulverizes with heat scrap metal and pulls out of it its original elements. And they are basically using that process to mine lithium. And that company to me is it took forever to build it at MIT and figure it out, but that company to me is a great example of what energy innovation can do here. Doesn't require the mining that's going on in China, doesn't require another country to basically be the main source of one of the main ingredients we need in car batteries for electric vehicles. Doesn't require a whole bunch of things that everybody just assumed we would have to have as a given to make this stuff work. That innovation piece has a big role to play, and I think the state needs to support it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And just for those who are watching who might not be familiar, the governor's referring to a $750 million infusion to the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is the clean tech incubator accelerator for the state. And that's a bill that has been proposed several times. So going to the audience questions, one thing that we've heard from a lot of folks is a question about the Peabody Peaker plant, which I'm sure you've gotten a lot of questions about that too. One person noted that UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez said recently that, in kind of sounding the alarm on climate change, that we really need to be rapidly phasing out fossil fuels if we're going to keep alive this goal of holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. So I'm curious, with these really ambitious climate plans on the books, how does the Baker administration reconcile those goals with fossil fuel projects like the Peaker plant?
So first of all, the Peaker plan replaces a very old and wildly polluting system that was in place previously. And the main reason it got the support of the municipal electric company up there, whose existing board members are all elected by the citizens of Peabody, was because it was a dramatic reduction in fossil fuel emissions or greenhouse gas emissions associated with that facility. Now, the difference is this facility will run on natural gas as opposed to the one that ran previously on, I think it was oil. But this is a Peaker plant. It's basically designed to work at very particular times when there's a really significant crimp on energy supply generally, and it will dramatically improve the amount of greenhouse gas emissions get emitted by that facility at the points in time when that needs to be done. Is that sort of like the be all end all? But it's just not true. No, but it's just not true to say that this won't dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions during the moments in time when that Peaker plant is actually being used, which is progress.
But we do have other peaker plants in the state. So I'm just curious, as we're thinking about bringing more and more clean energy into the grid, is a new peaker plant needed?
Well, they started working on this thing, I think, 10 years ago. And I think to do nothing would be worse. And let's face it, as you pointed out, there are bumps and bruises and detours along the way to actually to the practical reality of doing a lot of the work that you're talking about and we're talking about that needs to get done. I mean, we are going to have to put literally dozens just ourselves of new transmission infrastructure in place to make all the proposals we have on deep water wind work. Barnstable was a willing partner to serve as the shoreline connection for the Vineyard Wind project. That's a big win. But that's going to have to happen over and over and over again. And I think people need to understand that progress is progress here.
Yeah, okay. Another question, this one deals with transportation, wondering, given all of the emissions from the commuter rail especially, how can transportation be more environmentally friendly and still reliable?
So first of all, the biggest opportunity in public transportation, which is I'm assuming what they're talking about, is buses by far. And to build a fully electric bus system, which is what the MBTA is pursuing, you have to create the maintenance facilities to actually maintain them and keep them in working order. They are currently in the process of building 2 maintenance facilities. And we converted a big piece of what was previously a gas-only system into one where we have a lot of hybrid operating vehicles at this point in time. But the goal is to start with buses, and I think that's the right place to start, and then move between the MBTA's buses, the RTA's buses, school buses, school buses in particular, there's a big environmental justice issue at work as well. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to start with buses, and obviously commuter rail needs to be part of that mix, but you get a much bigger bang out of buses in the short term than you do out of commuter rail, and you get it for a price that's a lot lower.
Yeah. So we don't have a lot of time. This might actually have to be our last question, I think. But I'm just curious, and this came in from viewers as well. There have been challenges along the way. There has been this ambitious goal, but there have been roadblocks that you've encountered, as there always are when we try to do ambitious things. Given what you have experienced over the course of your time in office, what advice would you give to your successor about how to take ambitious plans on climate change and actually get them, over the finish line?
It's actually a really good question. I guess I'd say the following. The first is don't limit your field of vision to just one or two things. We've made proposals on a whole variety of pieces of this puzzle over the course of the past 7 years. And some of them we've actually gotten past, some of them we haven't. I still, we've put hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions if you add it all up, into municipal vulnerability work and environmental infrastructure and clean water, okay? And I have a very hard time making a lot of progress on much of any of that, which is surprising to me. I think the Hearst thing is another good example of where I thought the legislature would be interested in creating some kind of way of measuring residential property because it's a big piece of the mix. I think I was probably too early on that, but maybe that happens at some point later on. So you gotta play on a bunch of fields and assume that some will move sooner than others, some will move later, and to recognize and understand that what you really need to do is to continue to stay focused on it and to understand that not everybody's going to share your priorities with respect to what should happen first. But the final thing I would say is everybody has to be honest about the fact that some of this somewhere along the way is going to cause people some disruption. And I'll give you a really simple example of what I mean by that. There's a lot of talk about what we want to do with new construction, right? Mm-hmm. That's fine. Most of the places people live and work are not new construction. And they make up the vast majority of the places where our biggest opportunities are with regard to greenhouse gas emissions and energy efficiency. And I think it's important when we talk about this stuff to recognize and understand that if you only focus on the new stuff, you're leaving a lot of other stuff that's probably a little harder politically to get done off the table. And it all needs to be part of the conversation over time.
Well, thank you. Governor Baker, I am so appreciative of your time today. Thank you. Thank you. So glad to have had you here to help us launch this year's Sustainability Week. To those who have tuned in, I hope you'll come back for the rest of the events that we have in store this week. There's a lot of great stuff coming. Our presenting sponsor, Philips, is going to close us out. Thanks, Governor Baker.
Take care.
Thank you to Governor Baker for sharing your thoughts and for the work of your administration. And thank you to the Boston Globe, not only for the great programming this week, but also for your extended coverage and focus on climate action. We really hope you will all take full advantage of the upcoming sessions and discussions to learn more about sustainability and the urgency to act and find solutions to mitigate climate change. Please also join me tomorrow at noon for a live panel on environmental benefits of digital healthcare. I will be joined by several healthcare experts and zoom in on concrete tools and approaches for greening healthcare systems together. Thanks again and have a great day.